In August 1992, at Balmoral Castle, the Queen's summer residence in the Scottish Highlands, the morning papers arrived at the breakfast table as they did every day, ironed, folded, laid beside each place setting by staff who had performed this ritual for decades. Sarah Ferguson, Duchess of York, was seated among the family. She had been separated from Prince Andrew for 5 months by that point, but Balmoral invitations still arrived, and she still accepted them. The Daily Mirror that morning carried photographs across its front page. Photographs taken at a villa in the south of France, showing Sarah reclining by a swimming pool, while a man who was not her husband kissed her feet. The man was John Bryan, her American financial advisor. The photographs had been taken by a long-range lens. They were explicit, unmistakable, and now sitting in front of every member of the royal family simultaneously. According to Alan Starkey, a businessman and associate of Ferguson, who later wrote a detailed account of the period, she described the moment as the single worst experience of her life, not because of what the photographs showed, but because the Queen simply continued eating her toast. Sarah Margaret Ferguson was born on the 15th of October 1959 in London, the second daughter of Major Ronald Ferguson, a polo manager who counted the Prince of Wales among his regular players, and Susan Barantes, who would later leave the family and move to Argentina. The Ferguson household was county: horses, dogs, adequate income, social connections into the right circles, but not aristocratic in the way that mattered inside the palace. When Sarah married Prince Andrew on the 23rd of July 1986 at Westminster Abbey, the British press treated it as a fairy tale, with a better heroine than the first one. Diana Spencer had been shy, fragile, visibly overwhelmed. Ferguson was different. She was loud. She laughed in public. She wore green on her wedding day, which the tabloids adored. She was, in the language of that particular summer, refreshing. The public approval rating was immediate and, as it turned out, temporary. The machinery of royal life operates on a specific principle, that personal behavior is secondary to institutional function. The family exists to serve the crown. The crown exists to represent the nation. Everything else is managed. The Duchess of York entered this system at a moment when the institution was already under strain. Diana's marriage to Charles was fracturing privately and would fracture publicly within years. The Queen and Prince Philip had lived through decades of managing public perception with extraordinary discipline. What they expected from new entrants was simple: perform the duties, manage the image, do not generate unnecessary attention. Ferguson, by temperament and by circumstance, was incapable of meeting all 3 expectations simultaneously. The question that would define her next decade was whether the institution bore any responsibility for failing to support her, or whether the failure was entirely her own. The documented record suggests both, but one side of the ledger is considerably heavier than the other. In the spring of 1987, less than a year into the marriage, the new Duchess undertook a renovation of Sunninghill Park, the marital home gifted by the Queen. The cost of the renovation, reported across multiple newspapers and confirmed in Andrew Morton's account of the period, reached an estimated £5 million. The specification included a swimming pool, a private gymnasium, and extensive landscaping of the grounds, all financed while Andrew was frequently away on naval duty, and Sarah was left to manage the household with minimal palace guidance. Courtiers at Buckingham Palace, speaking to royal correspondent James Whittaker for his reporting in the Daily Mirror, described the spending as staggering for someone who had been in the family less than 12 months. The press, which had nicknamed the house South York as a pun on the television series, began to recalibrate its image of the Duchess. The detail that stuck was not the total figure itself, it was the speed. She had not waited, tested, or consulted. She had simply spent. That pattern would repeat with metronomic regularity for the next 2 decades. By 1990, Ferguson had developed what the tabloids called a holiday habit. She was photographed abroad repeatedly: skiing trips, beach holidays, extended stays in locations that required long-haul flights, while Andrew served with the Navy and public engagements went unfulfilled. In January 1990, photographs surfaced of her on a holiday in Morocco with Steve Wyatt, a Texas oil heir she had met through his stepfather's connections to the Middle East. The photographs, which showed the two together in apparently relaxed, personal circumstances, were unremarkable by civilian standards. By royal standards, they were incendiary. The photographs were not published immediately. They were discovered later, in 1992, left behind in a London flat, according to reporting by Andrew Morton and confirmed by multiple subsequent accounts. Their existence alone, circulating among editors and palace officials, was sufficient to accelerate the collapse of the marriage. The Duchess's own explanation, offered years later in her autobiography, My Story, was that Wyatt was simply a friend. The palace's silence on the matter told its own story. Friendship was not the issue. Perception was. On the 19th of March 1992, Buckingham Palace issued a formal statement confirming that the Duke and Duchess of York had agreed to separate. The terms, negotiated through palace channels and reported at the time by royal correspondent Robert Hardman, were specific. Sarah would retain her title, receive a financial settlement, and continue to attend some family events, provided she conducted herself with discretion. The word discretion appeared repeatedly in accounts of the arrangement. This was the chance. The palace was not offering forgiveness, it was offering managed containment. Ferguson would be permitted a soft landing, a gradual retreat from the centre of public attention, a path back toward respectability if she chose to walk it. The separation statement was carefully worded, deliberately neutral, designed to give her room. What she did with that room in the months that followed would determine everything. 5 months after the separation was announced, Ferguson was at Le Mas de Pignerol, a rented villa near Saint-Tropez in the south of France, with her financial advisor John Bryan. The photographs taken by the paparazzo Daniel Angeli, published on the 20th of August 1992 by the Daily Mirror, showed Bryan kissing and sucking the Duchess's toes beside the pool. Her young daughters, Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, were visible in some frames, playing nearby. The photographs were not ambiguous. They were not susceptible to innocent interpretation. They were published across virtually every major newspaper in Europe within 48 hours. Bryan, speaking to journalists afterwards, insisted the relationship was professional. No one with access to the images believed him. The timing, during the Balmoral gathering, 5 months into the arrangement that was supposed to protect her, was devastating. The chance the palace had offered her was, as one courtier told Penny Junor for her biography of the Prince of Wales, gone before the ink was dry. The immediate aftermath of the Bryan photographs was institutional exile. The Queen, according to multiple sources including Junor and biographer Sarah Bradford, made clear through intermediaries that Ferguson's presence at Balmoral was no longer expected. The guest list was adjusted. Phone calls were not returned. Staff who had been assigned to assist the Duchess were gradually reallocated. The financial settlement originally discussed was renegotiated downward. Ferguson, by the autumn of 1992, found herself outside the structure that had shaped her daily life for 6 years. No official diary, no palace support team, no automatic security detail, and rapidly diminishing income. The specifics of her financial position, documented by royal correspondent Richard Kay in the Daily Mail, were stark. She was expected to maintain a household, raise 2 daughters who were 5th and 6th in line to the throne, and appear in public as a semi-royal figure, all on a settlement that multiple financial commentators at the time described as inadequate for the obligations attached to it. What the tabloid narrative missed, and what the documentary record partially supports, was the degree to which Ferguson was left without the tools to succeed. Diana Spencer, navigating a parallel crisis in the same period, had access to private wealth through her family, the Spencers, and through a divorce settlement that would eventually total £17 million. Ferguson had no comparable family money. Her father, Major Ronald Ferguson, had been publicly humiliated by his own tabloid scandal, visiting a massage parlour in London in 1988, documented extensively at the time, and was not in a position to provide financial backstopping. When Ferguson turned to commercial ventures to generate income, she entered a world the palace considered beneath the dignity of anyone connected to the crown. Her children's book series, Budgie the Little Helicopter, published from 1989 onward, was commercially modest. Her attempts to establish herself as a public speaker in the American market met with mixed results. The underlying problem, as her ghostwriter Jeff Copeland described in interviews given years later, was simple. She had the title, the recognition, and the access, but no infrastructure, no advisors with genuine experience, and no institutional willingness to help her monetize any of it properly. By 1996, when the divorce was finalized on the 30th of May, Ferguson's debts had reached approximately £4.2 million. The figure was confirmed by multiple reporting sources at the time, including The Sun and the Daily Telegraph, and Ferguson herself later acknowledged it in interviews with Oprah Winfrey in 1996, and again in later years. The settlement from the divorce was reported at around £3 million. Offset against the debt, it left her in a net negative position. She retained the use of the marital home, Sunninghill Park, and shared custody of the children, but the financial mathematics of her situation were brutal. She was, in practical terms, a publicly visible former royal with negative net worth and no clear path to solvency. The revelation was not that she had spent too much. It was that the system had discharged her into civilian life with obligations calibrated for wealth she did not possess. In September 1997, at the funeral of Diana, Princess of Wales, the seating arrangements inside Westminster Abbey became, as royal historian Hugo Vickers noted in subsequent writing, a map of institutional standing. Ferguson attended. She was not, however, seated with the immediate royal family. Her position, visible but separated, was a physical expression of the terms that had governed her life since 1992. She was inside the building, but outside the circle. Observers at the time, including Vickers and journalist Tina Brown, in her later book The Diana Chronicles, noted that Ferguson appeared visibly affected during the service. She had been one of Diana's few genuine allies inside the palace. Their friendship, while complicated and periodically fractured, Diana had distanced herself from Ferguson in the early 90s over what she perceived as Sarah's poor judgment, was real. The funeral was not just a national event for Ferguson. It was a preview of how history would categorize her. Diana would be remembered as a martyr. Sarah would be remembered as a cautionary tale. Through the early 2000s, Ferguson pursued a rehabilitation strategy built almost entirely on the American market. She signed a deal with Weight Watchers International in 1997, reportedly worth $2 million, that gave her both income and a public narrative. Transformation, discipline, second chances. The campaign was professionally managed and reasonably successful in the United States, where the specifics of her royal disgrace carried less cultural weight. She appeared on American television regularly, gave motivational speeches, and marketed a range of lifestyle products. The difficulty, documented by journalist and Ferguson observer Geordie Greig in interviews and reporting during the period, was that each step forward in America was shadowed by continued hostility in the British press. Every new commercial venture was reported in London as evidence of vulgarity. Every public appearance was measured against an aristocratic standard she could not meet. The cycle was self-reinforcing. She needed money. She pursued money publicly, and the public pursuit of money confirmed the narrative that she was unsuitable. In May 2010, the News of the World, the Rupert Murdoch tabloid that would itself be closed the following year over phone hacking revelations, sent an undercover reporter posing as a wealthy businessman to meet Ferguson. The resulting footage, published on the 23rd of May, showed her offering access to Prince Andrew in exchange for £500,000. She was recorded saying, £500,000 when you can, to me, open doors. The footage was unambiguous. Ferguson issued a public statement within hours, describing herself as being in the gutter at that moment and admitting that she had been drinking. Andrew, through palace channels, confirmed that he had no knowledge of the arrangement and had not authorized it. The sting confirmed the worst version of every narrative that had circulated about Ferguson for 18 years, that she was willing to trade on her proximity to the royal family for personal financial gain, that she did so while carrying debts that had, by multiple accounts, climbed back towards significant figures after the Weight Watchers' income declined, added a layer of desperation that made the footage genuinely uncomfortable to watch. What the documented record reveals, when laid out chronologically, is not a story of simple bad character. It is a story of structural failure, compounded by personal weakness. Ferguson entered the royal family without adequate preparation. This is not in serious dispute. The palace's own mechanisms for integrating new members were, in the late 1980s, rudimentary. There was no formal induction. There was no financial education. There was no long-term career planning for a woman who might one day leave the institution and need to support herself. The assumption was permanence. When permanence failed, the institution's response was withdrawal, of support, of guidance, of the protective infrastructure that makes royal life functional. Ferguson's mistakes were real. The holidays were real. The spending was real. The Brian photographs were real. The News of the World footage was real. But the system that produced these outcomes was also real. A system that selected a young woman from a comfortable but not wealthy background, placed her inside one of the most scrutinized families on earth, provided minimal support during the marriage, and then discharged her into a financial and reputational crisis with insufficient resources to manage either. The pattern that emerges from the evidence is one of compulsive repetition. Each time Ferguson was offered a framework for recovery, the separation terms in 1992, the divorce settlement in 1996, the Weight Watchers reinvention in the late 90s, she would operate within it briefly, then act in ways that destroyed it. The mechanism was almost always the same. An opportunity would arise, requiring sustained discipline over months or years. Ferguson would engage with it genuinely. Then a shorter-term impulse, a holiday, a spending decision, a commercial arrangement that traded long-term reputation for immediate cash, would overtake the longer strategy. This is not a clinical diagnosis, but it is a pattern visible across 2 decades of documented behavior, and it is the pattern that explains the title of this account. She was given one chance to fix it. She was, in fact, given several. The result was the same each time. If this account has offered something useful, a clearer view of what happened and why, subscribing to the channel is the simplest way to see more of these stories. It costs nothing, and the notification bell ensures that the next one reaches you when it goes live. There are more figures like this, people whose public image and private reality diverged in ways that the standard narrative never quite captures. The Queen continued eating her toast. That is the detail, from that August morning at Balmoral in 1992, that outlasts every other element of the story. The photographs were spread across the table. The family was silent. The Duchess was present, and the Queen, who had spent 4 decades managing the distance between private feeling and public performance, simply continued with breakfast. It was not cruelty, it was method. The institution survives by refusing to react at the speed of scandal. Ferguson never learnt that skill, the capacity to absorb a blow without visible damage, to let the news cycle exhaust itself against disciplined silence. She reacted. She explained. She apologized publicly, repeatedly, in forums that multiplied the attention rather than diminishing it. The Queen's toast was the lesson she was never able to learn. The monarchy endures not because its members are without fault, but because they have mastered the appearance of continuity in the face of disruption. Ferguson disrupted, and then she disrupted her own recovery, and then she disrupted the disruption. The cycle did not stop because no one, not the palace, not her advisors, and not Ferguson herself, ever addressed the mechanism that drove it. She was given a chance.